Broken steel chains. Tallulah Tally Dawson had been warned about men like Jack Hollister drifters with sharp grins and hands that knew too much. But when he pulled her into the darkened alley behind the saloon, his fingers rough and knowing, she forgot every warning. He smirked, his breath warm against her ear. "You keep looking at me like that, sweetheart," he murmured. "And I might just take it as an invitation." Chapter 1. Sundown's Embrace and a Stolen Kiss. The sun bled crimson across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Arizona Territory, painting the dusty streets of Redemption in shades of fire and shadow. Tallulah Tally Dawson, her chestnut hair escaping the confines of its practical braid, wiped a smudge of flour from her cheek with the back of her hand. The scent of freshly baked bread, a comforting aroma in this harsh land, clung to her, a subtle defiance against the pervasive odors of dust, sweat, and something wilder, something untamed that always seemed to linger on the edge of town. She'd spent the better part of the afternoon at the bakery, a small, whitewashed building that stood as a beacon of normalcy amidst the saloons, gambling dens, and general stores that catered to the rough and tumble inhabitants of Redemption. Her mother, bless her departed soul, had always said that a good loaf of bread could soothe even the most troubled heart. Tally wasn't so sure about that, not anymore. Not after the troubles that had found their way to her own doorstep, leaving a trail of heartbreak and a lingering fear that settled deep in her bones. She glanced toward the setting sun, a familiar ache settling in her chest. It had been 2 years since her husband, Samuel, had ridden out with a posse chasing cattle rustlers, 2 years since she'd last seen his gentle smile, heard his quiet laugh. 2 years since the sheriff had returned, hat in hand, his face etched with a grim sorrow that mirrored her own. Samuel had been a good man, a steady man, a man who deserved more than a shallow grave on the windswept plains. Tally had inherited the bakery, the small ranch on the outskirts of town, and a mountain of grief she wasn't sure she'd ever conquer. Her older brother, Caleb, had tried to help, his gruff concern a constant presence in her life. But Caleb, for all his strength and loyalty, carried his own burdens, his own secrets etched onto his weathered face. The Dawson family was bound by more than blood. They were bound by a shared history, a legacy of resilience, and a code of honor that ran deeper than the deepest canyons. As dusk deepened, casting long, dancing shadows across the street, Tally locked up the bakery, the key heavy in her hand. She turned to walk toward the boarding house where she rented a small, sparsely furnished room, her footsteps echoing in the growing stillness. The saloons were already coming alive, raucous laughter and the tinny sound of a piano spilling out into the night. Tally usually avoided that part of town, especially after dark. But tonight, a strange restlessness pulled at her, a feeling she couldn't quite name. She found herself drawn toward the Golden Barrel Saloon, the largest and most notorious establishment in Redemption. It was a place where fortunes were won and lost, where secrets were whispered and deals were struck in the dimly lit corners. A place where men like Jack Hollister held court. Tally had seen him around town, of course. Everyone had. He'd drifted into Redemption a few weeks ago, a stranger with eyes the color of a stormy sky and a smile that promised both danger and delight. He moved with a lazy grace, a predator's confidence that both intrigued and unnerved her. He'd tipped his hat to her once, a fleeting, almost mocking gesture that had sent a shiver down her spine. Caleb had warned her about him, his voice low and serious. "He's trouble, Tally. Stay away from him." But tonight, trouble seemed to have a certain allure. As Tally hesitated near the entrance of the Golden Barrel, the batwing doors swung open, and a group of boisterous cowboys stumbled out, their laughter echoing in the night. Among them was Jack Hollister. He saw her standing there, a flicker of surprise, then amusement, crossing his face. He detached himself from the group, his movements fluid and deliberate, and walked toward her. "Evenin', Miss Dawson," he said, his voice a low, resonant drawl that seemed to wrap around her like the desert night. His eyes, even in the dim light, held a spark of something that made her heart beat a little faster. Tally found her voice, though it was a little unsteady. "Mr. Hollister." He leaned against the wooden railing, his gaze never leaving hers. "What brings a respectable lady like yourself to a place like this?" I was just passing by," she stammered, feeling foolish under his intense scrutiny. He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent another shiver down her spine. "Is that so? Or were you perhaps hoping to catch a glimpse of a certain troublemaker?" Tally's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "I don't know what you mean." He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the scent of whiskey and tobacco and something indefinably masculine filling her senses. "Don't you?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm, sending a jolt of electricity through her. Tally knew she should pull away, should run as fast as her legs could carry her. But she was rooted to the spot, mesmerized by his gaze, by the dangerous promise in his eyes. He guided her, almost without her realizing it, into the darkened alley beside the saloon. The noise from inside faded, replaced by the soft sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote. He stopped, his body close to hers, his warmth radiating through her thin cotton dress. His fingers, rough and knowing, traced the line of her jaw, sending a wave of heat through her. He smirked, his breath warm against her ear, the scent of whiskey stronger now, mingling with the dusty air. "You keep looking at me like that, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice a silken threat. "And I might just take it as an invitation." His words were a challenge, a dare, and something inside Tally, something long dormant, rose to meet it. She tilted her head back, her eyes meeting his, a flicker of defiance, of something wilder, burning in their depths. She had been warned. Caleb had warned her. Her own common sense had screamed at her to run. But in that moment, under the vast, star-studded Arizona sky, surrounded by the shadows and the silence, all she could feel was the undeniable pull, the magnetic force that drew her to this dangerous, captivating man. The kiss, when it came, was not gentle, not hesitant. It was a claiming, a branding, a fiery explosion of sensation that stole her breath and left her reeling. It was a kiss that tasted of whiskey and danger, of forbidden desire and the promise of something more. It was a kiss that changed everything. And as his arms closed and he pulled her into the shadowed embrace, she was already lost, and the only sound was that of her own heart, wild, pounding against a cage it seemed newly determined to break free from. Chapter 2. Echoes of warnings in the desert wind. The taste of Jack Hollister lingered on Tally's lips, a heady mix of whiskey and something untamed, a flavor that mirrored the man himself. She pulled away, breathless, her hand instinctively going to her mouth, as if to hold the sensation captive. The alley, shrouded in darkness moments before, now seemed to pulse with a dangerous energy, a reflection of the storm brewing within her. Jack watched her, his stormy eyes unreadable, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He didn't apologize, didn't offer any explanation. He simply stood there, a silent challenge, a blatant disregard for the unspoken rules that governed redemption, and perhaps her own heart. "You shouldn't have done that," Tally finally managed, her voice a shaky whisper that betrayed the turmoil inside. "Shouldn't I?" he countered, his voice low and smooth, like aged whiskey. "Seems to me you didn't exactly fight me off, Miss Dawson." His words, though true, stung. She hadn't fought him off. She had, for a fleeting, reckless moment, welcomed his embrace, surrendered to the intoxicating pull of his presence. Shame, hot and sharp, pricked at her. She was a widow, a respectable woman, a Dawson. She was supposed to be grieving, mourning, upholding the memory of her late husband, not succumbing to the advances of a drifter, an outlaw, a man who represented everything she should avoid. Tally began, then faltered, unable to articulate the conflicting emotions that raged within her. She wanted to slap him, to scream at him, to erase the memory of that kiss, of the way his touch had ignited a fire within her that she thought had long been extinguished. But she also wanted, with a desperate, unsettling yearning, to feel it again. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in the confined space of the alley. "Don't pretend, sweetheart," he said, his voice a soft, dangerous murmur. "We both know what happened here. And we both know it ain't over." His words, a blatant prediction, a promise of more to come, sent a shiver of both fear and anticipation down her spine. Tally turned and fled, her footsteps echoing on the hard-packed dirt, desperate to escape the confines of the alley, the intensity of his gaze, the undeniable truth of his words. She didn't stop running until she reached the boarding house, her lungs burning, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She fumbled with the key, her hands shaking, and finally managed to unlock the door to her small room. She slammed it shut behind her, leaning against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was simple, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table, and a single chair. A faded quilt, hand-stitched by her mother, lay folded at the foot of the bed, a tangible reminder of a life that felt a million miles away. Tally sank onto the bed, her legs trembling, her mind racing. She replayed the encounter in her head, each touch, each word, each stolen glance. She remembered the way his eyes had held hers, the way his hand had felt against her skin, the way his kiss had awakened something deep within her, something she had thought long dead. She touched her lips again, the ghost of his kiss still lingering. It was a kiss that had defied every rule, every expectation, every ounce of common sense she possessed. It was a kiss that had shattered the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. Images of Samuel, her late husband, flickered through her mind. His gentle smile, his kind eyes, his unwavering devotion. She felt a pang of guilt, a sharp stab of betrayal. Samuel had been a good man, a loving husband. He deserved her loyalty, her respect, her unending grief. He didn't deserve to be replaced in her thoughts, in her desires, by a man like Jack Hollister. But the truth was, Samuel was gone. And she was still here, still alive, still capable of feeling, of wanting, of yearning for something more than the quiet, lonely existence she had carved out for herself. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, a mournful sound that echoed the turmoil in her soul. It carried with it the whispers of warnings, the echoes of Caleb's gruff voice, the unspoken judgments of the townsfolk, the weight of her family's legacy. She knew what they would say, what they would think. They would call her foolish, reckless, a disgrace to Samuel's memory. They would warn her about Jack Hollister, about his reputation, about the danger he represented. They would tell her to stay away, to protect her heart, to uphold her honor. But the wind also carried something else, something that whispered of freedom, of passion, of a second chance at life, at love. It whispered of a possibility, however dangerous, however forbidden, that she couldn't quite ignore. Tally closed her eyes, her hands clenched into fists. She was torn, divided, caught between the safety of the past and the perilous allure of the present. She didn't know what the future held, what consequences awaited her, what price she would have to pay for that stolen kiss. All she knew was that her life, her carefully ordered, predictable life, had been irrevocably altered. The echoes of the warnings in the desert wind were loud, but so, too, was the beating of her own rebellious heart. And the last beat reminded her of his lips, and of the heat they had left, burning and waiting. Chapter 3. The invitation in her gaze. The following morning dawned bright and unforgiving, the Arizona sun already baking the dusty streets of Redemption by the time Tally opened the bakery. The scent of yeast and flour, usually a comfort, did little to soothe the lingering unease that had settled in her stomach. Sleep had been elusive, her dreams haunted by stormy eyes and a stolen kiss that felt more real than any dream should. She went through the motions, kneading dough, shaping loaves, tending the oven, her movements automatic, her mind elsewhere. She couldn't shake the image of Jack Hollister, the way he'd looked at her, the way he'd made her feel. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, a dangerous cocktail of fear and excitement, of shame and desire. She tried to focus on her work, on the familiar rhythm of the bakery, on the practical concerns of running a business, of surviving in this harsh land. But every time a customer walked through the door, her heart would skip a beat, her eyes scanning their face, half expecting, half dreading to see him. He didn't come. The morning passed slowly, marked by the steady stream of customers, the exchange of pleasantries, the clinking of coins. Old Mrs. Henderson, a regular with a penchant for gossip, lingered longer than usual, her sharp eyes scrutinizing Tally with an unnerving intensity. "You seem a bit peaked this morning, Tallulah," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. "Not getting enough sleep, are you?" Tally forced a smile, trying to appear unconcerned. "Just a bit tired, Mrs. Henderson. It's been a busy week." The old woman hummed, unconvinced. "Heard there was a bit of a commotion at the Golden Barrel last night. Some drifter causing trouble, I hear." Tally's heart clenched. She knew, without being told, who Mrs. Henderson was referring to. News traveled fast in Redemption, especially when it involved scandal or intrigue. "I wouldn't know anything about that," Tally said, her voice carefully neutral. "I don't frequent the saloons." "No, of course not," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "But a pretty young widow like yourself, well, you're bound to attract attention, whether you want it or not." Tally busied herself with arranging loaves of bread on the counter, avoiding the old woman's knowing gaze. She was aware of the whispers, the sideways glances, the unspoken judgments that followed her. She was a Dawson, after all, and the Dawsons were held to a higher standard, their lives scrutinized under the unforgiving glare of public opinion. She finished serving Mrs. Henderson, her hands trembling slightly, and breathed a sigh of relief when the old woman finally left. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if everyone in town knew about her encounter with Jack Hollister, as if they could see the mark he'd left on her, the invisible brand of that stolen kiss. As the midday sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the floor, Caleb walked in, his presence filling the small bakery. He was a tall, imposing figure, his face weathered and lined, his eyes, the same shade of brown as Tally's, filled with a mixture of concern and protectiveness. "Morning, Tally," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. He hung his hat on a peg by the door and leaned against the counter, his gaze studying her intently. "Caleb," she replied, trying to sound normal, trying to hide the turmoil that still churned within her. He didn't say anything for a moment, just watched her, his silence more unnerving than any interrogation. Tally knew he sensed something was amiss. Caleb had always been able to read her, to see through her carefully constructed facades. "You all right?" he finally asked, his voice low and serious. Tally forced a smile.
"Fine.
"Just busy." He raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Heard you were at the Golden Barrel last night." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Tally's heart sank. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but she had hoped to postpone it, to avoid the inevitable confrontation. "I was just passing by," she said, repeating the lie she'd told Mrs. Henderson. Caleb snorted. "Since when do you pass by the Golden Barrel? Especially after dark?" Tally avoided his gaze, her cheeks flushing. She couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't face the disappointment, the disapproval she knew she would see there. "He was there, wasn't he?" Caleb said, his voice hardening.
"Hollister."
Tally didn't answer, her silence confirmation enough. Caleb sighed, running a hand through his thick, graying hair. "Tally, I warned you about him. He's nothing but trouble. He's a drifter, an outlaw, a man with no ties, no loyalties. He'll use you, hurt you, and then he'll move on, leaving you with nothing but a broken heart." His words were harsh, but they were spoken with a brother's love, a brother's concern. Tally knew he was right. She knew she should heed his warning, but a part of her, a rebellious, reckless part, refused to listen. "He's not like that," she said, her voice barely a whisper, surprising even herself. Caleb stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and pity. "You don't know him, Tally. You don't know anything about him." "I know he kissed me," she blurted out, then immediately regretted her words. Caleb's face darkened. "He what?" Tally closed her eyes, wishing she could take back her impulsive confession. She had broken the unspoken rule, admitted to the forbidden, given voice to the dangerous desire that simmered within her. Caleb stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "He laid a hand on you?" Tally shook her head. "It wasn't like that. It was, I don't know, it just happened." "It just happened?" Caleb repeated, his voice laced with incredulity. "Tally, you're a grown woman, not a naive schoolgirl. You know how men like Hollister operate. They prey on vulnerable women. They use their charm, their lies, to get what they want." "He didn't lie to me," Tally said, defending him, even though she knew she shouldn't. "He didn't promise me anything." "He didn't have to," Caleb said, his voice softening slightly. "The invitation was in your gaze, Tally. In the way you looked at him. In the way you let him kiss you." His words hung in the air, and all she could think of was last night, her surrender, and the look that, she suddenly realized with devastating clarity, had indeed been an invitation. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past, Whispers of the Future. Caleb's words, stark and unyielding, echoed in Tally's mind long after he'd left the bakery. The invitation was in your gaze. The accusation, laced with a brother's protective disappointment, stung more than any outright condemnation. She had, in a moment of reckless abandon, betrayed not only Samuel's memory, but also the deeply ingrained code of the Dawson family. The afternoon wore on, the heat relentless, mirroring the burning shame that consumed her. Each customer's glance felt like an accusation, each whispered conversation a judgment. She longed for the solitude of her small room, for a respite from the prying eyes and the unspoken condemnations. As she finally closed up shop, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows across the dusty street, she saw him. Jack Hollister leaned against the hitching post across from the bakery, his posture relaxed, his gaze fixed on her. He hadn't been there moments before he'd appeared, as if conjured from the shadows themselves, a silent, watchful presence. Tally's heart skipped a beat, a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling excitement coursing through her. She considered retreating back into the bakery, locking the door, pretending she hadn't seen him. But it was too late. He'd already seen her, and his eyes held her captive, a silent communication that transcended words. He pushed himself off the hitching post and sauntered across the street, his movements fluid and graceful, like a predator approaching its prey. Tally stood her ground, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Evenin', Miss Dawson," he said, his voice a low drawl that sent a shiver down her spine. He stopped a few feet away, respecting the boundaries, but his presence, his sheer magnetism, filled the space between them. "Mr. Hollister," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the turmoil within. He tilted his head, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Seems we keep running into each other." "It's a small town," Tally said, her voice carefully neutral. "Is that all it is?" He countered, his eyes searching hers, probing for something deeper. Tally didn't answer. She couldn't. She didn't know the answer herself. Was it just coincidence? Or was it something more, something fated, something neither of them could control? "Your brother doesn't approve of me," he said, changing the subject, his voice losing some of its playful edge. Tally's gaze flickered to his, surprised by his candor. "Caleb is protective," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Protective?" Jack chuckled, a low, throaty sound. "Or possessive?" Tally bristled at his implication. "Caleb is my brother. He cares about my well-being. And I don't," he challenged, his eyes narrowing, a hint of steel beneath his easygoing demeanor. Tally was taken aback by his question, by the intensity behind it. She didn't know what to say. She barely knew this man, this drifter, this outlaw. She shouldn't trust him, shouldn't even be talking to him. But there was something about him, something that drew her in, something that defied logic and reason. "I don't know you, Mr. Hollister," she finally said, her voice a soft, honest admission. "You kissed me," he reminded her, his voice a low murmur that sent a fresh wave of heat through her. "That was a mistake," she said, though even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, the scent of leather and dust and something indefinably masculine filling her senses.
Was it?
He whispered, his eyes locking with hers. Tally couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't look away. She was caught in his gaze, trapped by the magnetic pull that emanated from him. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. Tally flinched, but didn't pull away. "I don't make mistakes, Miss Dawson," he said, his voice a soft, dangerous promise. "And neither do you." His words hung in the air, a challenge, an invitation, a foreshadowing of something inevitable. Tally knew she should run, should escape while she still could. But she was rooted to the spot, mesmerized by his gaze, by the dangerous allure of the unknown. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I know about your husband, Tally," he whispered, his voice sending a shiver of both fear and anticipation down her spine. "I know about the shadows that haunt you, the whispers of the past that keep you chained to a memory." Tally's eyes widened in surprise. How could he know? Who had told him? "Redemption has a long memory," he continued, his voice a low murmur. "And so do I."
But the past is just that, Tally. Past.
It's the future that matters. And I see a future for us, a future that's as wild and untamed as this land. His words, a mixture of truth and seduction, resonated deep within her. He saw her, truly saw her, not just the grieving widow, not just the Dawson, but the woman beneath, the woman yearning for something more, something real. The sun had set. Only the faintest glow remained, and with it, her last grip on reason began to slip, and a future, any future, seemed possible. Chapter 5. Beneath the Weight of a Frontier Sky. Jack's words, promising a future as wild and untamed as the Arizona Territory, hung in the twilight air, a stark contrast to the heavy weight of the past that Tally carried. He knew about Samuel, about the circumstances of his death, about the whispers that still circulated in redemption, painting her as either a tragic figure or a woman tainted by association. He hadn't elaborated, hadn't revealed the source of his information, but the mere fact that he knew, that he acknowledged the shadows that haunted her, created a strange, unsettling intimacy between them. It was as if he had peered into her soul, seen the hidden wounds she had carefully concealed from the world. "The future," Tally repeated, her voice barely a whisper, the word feeling foreign and fragile on her tongue. She hadn't allowed herself to think about the future, not in any real, tangible way. Her life had been defined by the past, by the loss of Samuel, by the expectations of her family, by the rigid constraints of redemption society. "What future?" she asked, her voice laced with a mixture of skepticism and a desperate, hidden hope. Jack smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "A future where you're not defined by your grief, by your family, by this town," he said, his voice low and persuasive. "A future where you're free to be yourself, to make your own choices, to live life on your own terms." His words were seductive, intoxicating, a stark contrast to the suffocating expectations that had always surrounded her. He was offering her an escape, a chance to break free from the shackles of the past, to embrace a life she had never dared to imagine. But it was also a dangerous offer, a reckless gamble. To accept his invitation, to embrace this unknown future, would mean turning her back on everything she had ever known, defying her family, risking her reputation, and potentially her heart. "That's a pretty picture you paint, Mr. Hollister," Tally said, trying to sound cynical, trying to maintain a semblance of control. "But this is redemption. Things don't change that easily." "Things can change," he countered, his eyes holding hers, "if you're brave enough to make them change." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, not quite touching, but close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Tally's breath caught in her throat. She was acutely aware of his proximity, of the dangerous energy that crackled between them. "I don't know if I'm brave enough," she admitted, her voice a soft, honest confession. He gently took her hand, his fingers strong and calloused, engulfing hers. The touch, surprisingly gentle, sent a wave of warmth through her, melting some of the icy fear that had gripped her heart. "You are Tally," he said, his voice a low, reassuring murmur. "You're stronger than you think. You've survived loss, heartbreak, the weight of expectations. You've got the fire of the Dawsons in you, the spirit of this land. Don't let it be extinguished." His words resonated deep within her, stirring something dormant, something she had thought long dead. He saw a strength in her that she hadn't recognized in herself, a resilience that had been buried beneath layers of grief and self-doubt. He led her, without a word, away from the bakery, away from the prying eyes of the town, toward the outskirts of redemption. The sky above was a vast, inky canvas, studded with 1,000,000 stars, a breathtaking spectacle that dwarfed their earthly concerns. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust, a familiar, comforting aroma that grounded her. They walked in silence, their hands clasped together, the only sound their footsteps on the hard-packed earth and the distant howl of a coyote. Tally felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years, a feeling of being connected to something larger than herself, something wild and untamed. They stopped at a rise overlooking the town, the flickering lights of redemption spread out below them like a scattering of fallen stars. The vastness of the landscape, the immensity of the sky, put their lives, their struggles, into perspective. Jack turned to her, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the starlight, his eyes searching hers. "This is your life, Tally," he said, his voice a low, earnest murmur. "This is your land. Don't let anyone tell you how to live it. Don't let anyone steal your joy, your freedom, your future." His words, spoken under the weight of the frontier sky, felt like a truth, a revelation. He was offering her a choice, a chance to rewrite her story, to create a new narrative for herself. Tally looked out at the vast expanse before her, at the town that had both sheltered and suffocated her, at the land that had both sustained and challenged her. She thought of Samuel, of his gentle spirit, of the life they had shared. She thought of Caleb, of his unwavering loyalty, of the burden of family expectations. And then she thought of Jack, of his dangerous smile, of his untamed spirit, of the promise of a future that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs, and made a decision. A decision that would change everything. And as she turned to him, the first stars reflecting in his stormy eyes, all she could think of was the vast expanse and of the freedom it promised. Chapter 6. The Dance of Defiance and Desire. The decision, made under the vast, star-studded Arizona sky, felt both reckless and liberating. Tally had chosen to defy expectations, to embrace the unknown, to explore the dangerous, intoxicating connection she felt with Jack Hollister. She hadn't spoken the words aloud, hadn't made any explicit promises, but the silent understanding between them was clear. She was willing to dance with him, to step into the shadows, to risk the consequences. He seemed to understand, his eyes reflecting a mixture of triumph and respect. He didn't press her for answers, didn't try to rush her, but simply held her hand, his touch a silent reassurance, a promise of shared adventure. They walked back toward town, the silence between them comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. The lights of redemption grew closer, the sounds of the saloons, the laughter, the music, a reminder of the world they were returning to, a world that wouldn't understand their connection, their unspoken pact. As they neared the bakery, Jack stopped, his hand tightening on hers. "I won't pretend this will be easy, Tally," he said, his voice low and serious. "There will be whispers, judgments, opposition. Your brother, for one, will likely try to tear us apart." Tally nodded, her heart heavy with the truth of his words. She knew the challenges that lay ahead, the obstacles they would have to overcome. But she also felt a newfound strength, a determination she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm not afraid of whispers," she said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting his. And Caleb, he'll come around. Eventually. Jack smiled, a slow, appreciative smile that sent a warmth through her. You're a Dawson, all right, he said, his voice laced with admiration. Strong, stubborn, and fiercely independent. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver down her spine. Tally didn't pull away, didn't resist. She allowed herself to feel, to savor the moment, to acknowledge the undeniable attraction that sizzled between them. I have to go, she said, her voice a soft, reluctant whisper. She needed time to process, to prepare herself for the inevitable fallout, to find the words to explain her decision to Caleb. He nodded, understanding. I'll see you tomorrow, he said, his voice a promise. He released her hand, and Tally turned and walked toward the bakery, her heart pounding a mixture of fear and excitement. She felt as if she had stepped onto a new path, a dangerous, uncharted path that could lead to either heartbreak or happiness. She didn't know which it would be, but she was willing to take the risk, to embrace the uncertainty, to dance with the devil himself. The next morning, Tally awoke with a sense of purpose, a determination to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant dress, a subtle act of defiance against the expectations of mourning and widowhood. She braided her hair, securing it with a ribbon, a small act of reclaiming her own identity. As she opened the bakery, the scent of fresh bread filling the air, she felt a sense of anticipation, a nervous excitement that she couldn't quite suppress. She knew Jack would come, and she was both dreading and yearning for his arrival. The morning passed slowly, marked by the usual routine of customers and conversations. Tally tried to appear normal, to hide the inner turmoil that churned within her, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being judged. She saw Caleb across the street, his eyes fixed on the bakery, his expression grim and disapproving. He didn't come in, didn't approach her, but his presence was a constant reminder of the conflict that loomed, of the family loyalty she was betraying. Finally, as the midday sun streamed through the window, Jack walked in. He was dressed in his usual attire, dark pants, a worn shirt, a leather vest, and a gun belt strapped to his hip. He looked every bit the outlaw, the drifter, the dangerous man Caleb had warned her about. But to Tally, he looked like something else. He looked like freedom, like adventure, like a chance at a new life. He smiled when he saw her, a slow, knowing smile that sent a warmth through her. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. The silent communication between them was stronger than words. Morning, Miss Dawson, he said, his voice a low drawl that sent a familiar shiver down her spine. Mr. Hollister, she replied, her voice steady, her gaze meeting his. He leaned against the counter, his presence filling the small bakery. I was hoping I'd find you here, he said, his eyes searching hers. And where else would I be? Tally countered, a hint of defiance in her voice. He chuckled, a low, throaty sound. Running away with me, perhaps? Tally's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. Don't be ridiculous. Am I? He challenged, his eyes twinkling with amusement. I think you're tempted, Tally. I think you're more tempted than you'd like to admit. His words were true, and Tally knew it. She was tempted, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. She was dancing with desire, playing with fire, and she knew she could get burned. But she couldn't stop herself. She was caught in his orbit, pulled by his gravity, drawn to his dangerous, intoxicating allure. The dance had begun, and there was no turning back. She turned and pretended to look for something. But her mind was not with bread, it was with him, and with the danger and the desire, which she felt mixing inside of her. Chapter 7. Scars that time cannot erase. The tension in the bakery was palpable, a silent battle of wills and desires playing out between Tally and Jack. He knew he was pushing her, challenging her, forcing her to confront the feelings she had tried so hard to suppress. And she, in turn, was resisting, holding on to the remnants of her old life, even as she felt herself being drawn into his orbit. So, Jack said, breaking the silence, his voice a low, casual drawl that belied the intensity of his gaze.
What are we going to do about this, Tally?
Tally turned to face him, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. About what, Mr. Hollister? She asked, her voice deliberately formal, a shield against his probing. About this attraction, he said, his eyes holding hers, this connection. This feeling that keeps pulling us together, despite everything. Tally couldn't deny it. She felt it too, this undeniable force, this magnetic pull that defied logic, reason, and the expectations of everyone around them. But admitting it aloud, acknowledging it to him, felt like a surrender, a betrayal of everything she had ever held dear. I don't know what you're talking about, she lied, her voice trembling slightly, betraying her inner turmoil. Jack raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Don't you, Tally? He challenged. Or are you just afraid to admit it? He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his presence overwhelming. Tally's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She was acutely aware of his proximity, of the scent of leather and dust, and something indefinably masculine that emanated from him. I'm not afraid of anything, she said, her voice stronger this time, fueled by a surge of defiance. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver down her spine. Tally flinched, but didn't pull away. Then what is it, sweetheart? He whispered, his voice a soft, seductive murmur. What's holding you back? Tally closed her eyes, struggling to maintain control, to resist the overwhelming urge to lean into his touch, to surrender to the feelings he evoked within her. My past, she said, her voice barely a whisper, the words raw and honest. My family, this town, everything. He nodded, understanding. The past is a heavy burden, Tally, he said, his voice softening, his touch gentler now. But it doesn't have to define you. It doesn't have to control you. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs caressing her cheeks, his eyes searching hers. Tally's breath hitched in her throat. She was lost in his gaze, trapped by the intensity of his emotions, by the sincerity she saw in his stormy eyes. I have a past too, Tally, he said, his voice low and rough, revealing a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. Scars that time cannot erase. Things I've done, things I regret, things that haunt me. His words surprised her. She had seen him as a confident, carefree drifter, a man without ties, without regrets. But now, she glimpsed a different side of him, a man burdened by his own demons, his own past. What scars? She asked, her voice soft, curious, drawn to his vulnerability. He hesitated, his gaze flickering away from hers, a shadow crossing his face. Let's just say I've lived a life that's not always been honorable, he said, his voice evasive. I've made choices I'm not proud of. I've hurt people. Tally sensed a deep pain in his words, a hidden sorrow that resonated with her own. She knew what it was like to carry the weight of regret, to be haunted by the ghosts of the past. We all have, she said, her voice quiet, understanding. We all make mistakes. We all have things we wish we could undo. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper, something that made her heart ache. But we can't change the past, Tally, he said, his voice firm. We can only learn from it. And we can choose to move forward, to create a new future, a future that's not defined by our mistakes. His words were a balm to her soul, a validation of the feelings she had been struggling with. He understood her, he accepted her, flaws and all. He wasn't judging her, wasn't condemning her. He was offering her a chance at redemption, a chance to heal, a chance to love again. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her lips. Let me help you, Tally, he whispered. Let me help you forget the past. Let me show you a future where you can be happy, where you can be free. The scars he spoke of seemed to draw closer and closer, and despite all her instincts, she wanted nothing more than to meet them. Chapter 8. A gamble on trust, a wager on love. His plea, whispered against her lips, was a temptation almost impossible to resist. Let me help you forget the past. The promise of escape, of healing, of a love that could erase the pain and regret, was a powerful lure. Tally wavered, her defenses crumbling, her resolve weakening under the intensity of his gaze, the sincerity of his words. She looked into his stormy eyes, searching for any hint of deception, any sign of the outlaw, the drifter, the dangerous man she had been warned about. But all she saw was vulnerability, a shared pain, a desperate yearning for connection that mirrored her own.
How?
She asked, her voice a breathless whisper, the question both a plea and a challenge. How could he possibly erase the years of grief, the weight of expectations, the whispers that followed her like a shadow? He didn't answer with words. Instead, he leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was vastly different from their first, stolen encounter. This kiss was not about passion or defiance, it was about connection, about understanding, about a shared vulnerability that transcended words. It was a kiss that tasted of hope, of forgiveness, of a second chance. It was a kiss that melted the icy walls around her heart, allowing a warmth to spread through her that she hadn't felt in years. Tally responded, hesitantly at first, then with increasing fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, her fingers tangling in his thick, dark hair. She poured all her longing, all her grief, all her hope into that kiss, a silent communication that spoke volumes. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, the world seemed to have shifted on its axis. The bakery, the town, the whispers, all faded into the background, replaced by the overwhelming presence of this man, this connection, this gamble on trust, this wager on love. I don't have all the answers, Tally, Jack said, his voice rough with emotion, his hands still cupping her face. I can't promise you a life of ease, a life without challenges. But I can promise you this. I'll stand by you. I'll fight for you. I'll help you carry your burdens, just as you help me carry mine. His words were not a grand declaration of love, not a sweeping romantic gesture. They were something more profound, something more real. They were a promise of loyalty, of partnership, of a shared journey through the uncertainties of life. Tally looked at him, her heart overflowing with a mixture of emotions. Fear, yes, but also hope, excitement, and a growing affection for this complex, flawed, and undeniably captivating man. I don't expect you to have all the answers, she said, her voice soft but firm. I need someone to stand with me. Someone to believe in me, even when I don't believe in myself. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. I can do that, Tally, he said. I can definitely do that. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, a silent pact, a tangible symbol of their commitment. Tally felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years, a feeling of being grounded, of being connected, of being loved. But even as she basked in the warmth of this newfound connection, a shadow of doubt lingered. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Caleb, the town, the weight of her past, all stood as obstacles to their happiness. What about Caleb? She asked, her voice filled with concern. He'll never accept this. He'll never forgive me. Jack's expression turned serious. I know, he said. But we'll face him together. We'll face whatever comes our way, together. His confidence, his unwavering belief in their ability to overcome any obstacle, gave her strength. She squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. And the town? She continued, voicing her fears. The whispers, the judgments, let them whisper, Jack said, his voice firm, his eyes flashing with defiance. Let them judge. Their opinions don't matter. What matters is us, Tally. What matters is what we feel, what we believe in. His words were a balm to her soul, a reassurance that she wasn't alone, that she had someone on her side, someone who would fight for her, even against the entire town of redemption. It was a gamble, a risky wager on a future that was uncertain. But as Tally looked into Jack's eyes, into the depths of his soul, she knew she was willing to take that gamble, to bet on love, to trust in the connection that had blossomed between them, a fragile flower pushing through the hard, unforgiving ground of the Arizona territory. It was a bet, and the highest one she had ever placed. And as she held his hand, tighter now, she decided she would not fold, no matter what cards she was dealt. Chapter 9. The Price of Freedom, the Cost of Loyalty. The decision to embrace her feelings for Jack, to defy the expectations of her family and the town, was a turning point for Tally. But it was also the beginning of a new set of challenges, a reckoning with the consequences of her choices. Freedom, she was quickly learning, came at a price. And loyalty, especially to family, carried a heavy cost. The first and most formidable obstacle was Caleb. Her brother, her protector, the man who had always been her anchor in a turbulent world, was now her biggest adversary. He had seen them together, of course. Redemption was too small for secrets, and the sight of Tally Dawson, the grieving widow, walking hand in hand with Jack Hollister, the notorious drifter, had spread like wildfire through the town. The confrontation was inevitable, and it happened sooner than Tally had anticipated. She had just closed the bakery for the evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the street, when Caleb appeared, his silhouette framed against the fiery sky, his expression grim and unyielding. "Tally," he said, his voice low and tight, devoid of its usual warmth. "We need to talk." Tally's heart sank. She knew this conversation would be difficult, painful, but she had steeled herself for it. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it, no matter the cost. "I know, Caleb," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, her gaze meeting his. He stepped closer, his presence imposing, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, disappointment, and a deep, abiding hurt. "What is going on with you and Hollister?" he demanded, his voice laced with accusation. "We're seeing each other," Tally said, choosing her words carefully, trying to avoid a direct confrontation. Caleb snorted, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "Seeing each other?" "Tally, he's an outlaw, a drifter, a man with no ties, no loyalties. He'll use you, hurt you, and then he'll move on, leaving you with nothing but a broken heart. I warned you." His words, a repetition of his earlier warning, stung, but Tally refused to back down. "He's not what you think, Caleb," she said, her voice firm, her eyes flashing with defiance. "He's different." "Different?" Caleb scoffed. "He's a criminal, Tally. He's probably wanted in a dozen territories. He's not fit to shine Samuel's boots." The mention of Samuel's name, the invocation of her late husband's memory, was a low blow, a deliberate attempt to wound her. Tally felt a pang of guilt, a sharp stab of betrayal. But she also felt a surge of anger, a righteous indignation at Caleb's unfairness, his unwillingness to see beyond his own prejudices. "Samuel is gone, Caleb," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "And I'm still here. I have to live my life. I can't spend the rest of my days mourning him, living in the past." "So you choose to dishonor his memory by consorting with a," Caleb sputtered, unable to find a word vile enough to describe Jack. "I'm not dishonoring him," Tally said, her voice rising. "I loved Samuel. I'll always love him. But he wouldn't want me to be alone, to be miserable. He would want me to be happy." "Happy?" Caleb roared. "Happy with him? With a man who represents everything we stand against? A man who could get you killed?" Tally flinched at his words, but she stood her ground. "I'm not afraid, Caleb," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less determined. "I'm not a child anymore. I can make my own choices. I can take care of myself." Caleb stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and despair. He had always been her protector, her shield against the world. But now, she was rejecting his protection, choosing a different path, a path he couldn't follow, a path he couldn't understand. "You're breaking my heart, Tally," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're tearing this family apart." His words, spoken with such raw pain, were like a knife to Tally's heart. She loved Caleb, she cherished their bond, but she couldn't sacrifice her own happiness, her own future, for the sake of family loyalty. "I'm sorry, Caleb," she said, her voice filled with genuine sorrow. "I don't want to hurt you, but I can't live my life according to your rules, according to your expectations. I have to follow my own heart." Caleb turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, his gait heavy. He didn't look back, didn't say goodbye. He simply disappeared into the shadows, leaving Tally alone, heartbroken, but resolute. The price of freedom was high, the cost of loyalty even higher. But she had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences, whatever they may be. And as she saw his silhouette fade, the cost felt immense, heavier than she ever thought it would be. Chapter 10. Between the Law and the Outlaw's Heart. The rift between Tally and Caleb cast a long shadow over her burgeoning relationship with Jack. The joy of their stolen moments, the whispered conversations, the tender kisses, were tempered by the knowledge that their love was a source of pain and division. Redemption, a town already divided by its own internal conflicts and unspoken rules, now seemed to hold its breath, watching the unfolding drama between the Dawson widow and the enigmatic drifter. Jack, to his credit, understood the weight of Tally's sacrifice. He didn't pressure her, didn't try to force her to choose between him and her family. He simply offered his support, his unwavering presence, a silent promise to stand by her, no matter what. "He'll come around, Tally," he said one evening, as they sat on the porch of the bakery, watching the stars emerge in the vast, darkening sky. "Give him time." Tally sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder, finding comfort in his warmth, in his strength.
"I don't know, Jack," she said.
"Caleb is stubborn.
He holds on to things.
He sees the world in black and white, good and evil. And you're definitely in the evil category in his eyes." Jack chuckled a low, rueful sound.
"I can't argue with that," he said.
"I've done things, lived a life that, well, it wouldn't exactly earn me any points with your brother." He was referring, of course, to his past, the shadowy life he had hinted at, the scars he carried. Tally had yet to learn the full extent of his history, the details of the choices he had made, the deeds that haunted him. But she sensed a deep well of regret, a yearning for redemption that mirrored her own. "Tell me," she said, her voice soft, her hand seeking his.
"Tell me about your past. I want to know everything."
He hesitated, his gaze flickering away from hers, a shadow crossing his face. He was reluctant, she knew, to reveal the darker aspects of his life, to risk shattering the fragile image she had of him. "It's not a pretty story, Tally," he said, his voice low and rough. "It's full of violence, betrayal, and choices I'm not proud of." "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice firm, her grip tightening on his hand.
"I want to know the real you, Jack."
"All of you. The good, the bad, and the ugly." He took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs, and began to speak. He told her about his life before redemption, a life lived on the fringes of society, a life of drifting, of running, of making a living by whatever means necessary. He spoke of his involvement with a gang of outlaws, of robberies, of gunfights, of a code of loyalty that was often twisted and betrayed. He didn't glorify his past, didn't try to justify his actions. He simply laid it bare, exposing his wounds, his flaws, his regrets. He spoke of a man he had killed, a man who had been his friend, a man he had betrayed for the sake of survival. Tally listened, her heart aching for him, for the pain he carried, for the choices he had made. She didn't judge him, didn't condemn him. She simply offered her understanding, her compassion, her unwavering support. "I'm not that man anymore, Tally," he said, his voice filled with a desperate plea for belief. "I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be better. You're my reason. You're my chance at a new life." Tally believed him. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine remorse in his voice. She knew he was flawed, damaged, but she also saw a goodness in him, a potential for redemption that she was determined to nurture. "I know," she said, her voice soft, her hand caressing his cheek. "I see it, Jack. I believe in you." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, the heavy tread of boots on the wooden sidewalk. Sheriff Brody, a tall, imposing figure with a stern face and a weary gaze, stood before them, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Hollister," he said, his voice gruff, his eyes fixed on Jack. "I need to talk to you." Jack's body tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his own gun. Tally felt a surge of fear, a premonition of danger. "What about Sheriff?" Jack asked, his voice carefully neutral, his eyes wary. "About your past," Brody said, his gaze unwavering. "About your associates. About the rumors that have been circulating." Tally's heart sank. She knew this moment was inevitable, that Jack's past would eventually catch up with him. But she had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that they would have more time, that they could somehow escape the long arm of the law, the consequences of his former life. He was between two worlds, the law, represented by Brody, and her, representing the man he was struggling to become. "I'm listening," Jack said, his voice calm, but his body coiled, ready for action. "I've received a telegram from the Pinkerton agency," Brody said, his hand still on his gun. "They're looking for a man matching your description. A man involved in a series of robberies, a man with a price on his head." Tally gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This was worse than she had imagined. Jack wasn't just a drifter, a man with a checkered past. He was a wanted man, an outlaw with a bounty on his head. "And?" Jack asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "And," Brody said, his eyes meeting Jack's, "I'm going to give you a choice. You can leave redemption, quietly, peacefully, and I'll forget I ever saw you. Or you can stay, and I'll be forced to arrest you, to turn you over to the Pinkertons." It was a choice between the law, represented by the weary sheriff, and the outlaw's heart, which beat now, she knew, only for her. The choice, he knew, could cost him everything. Chapter 11. The Unveiling of Hidden Truths. Sheriff Brody's ultimatum hung in the air, a stark choice between freedom and capture, between a life on the run and a future with Tally. Jack's hand tightened on hers, his knuckles white, his body coiled with tension. He was trapped, caught between the consequences of his past and the promise of his future. Tally looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a desperate hope. She knew this was a pivotal moment, a turning point in their lives. His decision would determine not only his fate but also theirs. "What will you do, Jack?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, her gaze searching his. He didn't answer immediately. He stared at Sheriff Brody, his eyes narrowed, his jaw tight, weighing his options, calculating the risks. He was a man used to living on the edge, to making quick decisions, to surviving by his wits and his gun. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever before. "You'd let me go?" Jack asked, his voice low and skeptical, his eyes still fixed on Brody. "Just like that? After all the trouble I've caused?" Brody sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I'm tired, Hollister," he said, his voice weary. "Tired of the violence, the bloodshed, the endless cycle of crime and punishment. I've seen too much death, too much suffering in this town." He looked at Tally, his gaze softening slightly. "I know you care about him, Miss Dawson," he said. "And I believe he cares about you. Maybe that's enough to make a difference. Maybe he deserves a second chance." His words were a surprise, a glimmer of hope in a seemingly hopeless situation. Brody, the stern, unyielding lawman, was showing compassion, offering a way out, a chance for redemption. "But," Brody continued, his voice hardening again, "if you stay, Hollister, and you cause any more trouble, I won't hesitate to bring you in, dead or alive." Jack nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation, the precariousness of his position. He was being given a reprieve, a temporary stay of execution, but it came with a heavy price, a constant threat hanging over his head. "I appreciate that, Sheriff," Jack said, his voice sincere, his gaze unwavering. "I won't forget it." He turned to Tally, his eyes softening, his hand caressing her cheek. "I'm staying," he said, his voice firm, his decision made. "I'm not running anymore. I'm staying here, with you." Tally's heart soared with relief, with joy, with a love that defied logic and reason. He had chosen her, chosen their future, over a life of freedom, of escape. He had chosen to face the consequences of his past, to fight for their love, to build a new life with her in redemption. But even as she rejoiced in his decision, a nagging doubt lingered. She knew his past wouldn't simply disappear. The Pinkertons, the bounty hunters, the ghosts of his former life, would still be out there, hunting him. "Are you sure, Jack?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "This is dangerous. You could be killed." He smiled, a slow, reassuring smile that reached his eyes. "I'm not afraid, Tally," he said. "Not anymore. I have something to live for now. Something worth fighting for." He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, passionate kiss that sealed their commitment, their unwavering love. It was a kiss that defied the odds, that challenged the past, that embraced the uncertain future. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity, a flurry of preparations and whispered conversations. Jack, with Tally's help, began to build a new life for himself in redemption. He found work at the local livery stable, mucking out stalls, tending horses, earning an honest living for the first time in his life. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was a start. It was a way to prove himself, to show the town, to show Caleb that he was serious about changing, about becoming a better man. But the past, as Tally had feared, wouldn't stay buried. A few days after Sheriff Brody's visit, a stranger arrived in town, a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a ruthless demeanor. He introduced himself as Silas, a Pinkerton agent, and he was looking for Jack Hollister. Silas wasted no time in making his presence known. He questioned the townsfolk, interrogated Sheriff Brody, and made it clear that he wouldn't leave until he had found his man. He offered a substantial reward for any information leading to Jack's capture, turning the town into a hotbed of suspicion and fear. Tally was terrified. She knew Silas was dangerous, relentless, and that he wouldn't hesitate to use violence to achieve his goals. She feared for Jack's safety, for their future, for the fragile new life they were trying to build. Jack, however, remained calm, resolute. He knew this day would come, that his past would eventually catch up with him. He was prepared to face the consequences, to fight for his freedom, to protect the woman he loved. The hidden truths were coming out, and the unveiling had the potential to destroy it all. The truth, which he knew was unavoidable, was now upon them. Chapter 12. Broken Bonds and Forged Promises. Silas's arrival in redemption shattered the fragile peace that Tally and Jack had begun to build. The Pinkerton agent's relentless pursuit, his unwavering determination to capture Jack, cast a dark cloud over their lives, threatening to destroy everything they held dear. Tally lived in constant fear, her nerves frayed, her sleep disturbed by nightmares of Jack being dragged away in chains, of their love being torn apart by the forces of his past. She saw suspicion in the eyes of the townsfolk, heard whispers behind her back, felt the weight of their judgment, their condemnation. Jack, despite his outward calm, was also affected by the pressure. He knew he was living on borrowed time, that Silas's presence was a constant threat, a ticking clock counting down to an inevitable confrontation. He doubled his efforts at the livery stable, working long hours, trying to prove his worth, to show the town that he was a changed man. But he also knew that his past, his reputation, would always be a barrier, a shadow that followed him wherever he went. The tension between Tally and Caleb reached a breaking point. Her brother, fueled by a mixture of protectiveness and a deep-seated sense of betrayal, refused to accept Jack, to acknowledge their relationship. He saw Jack as a threat, a danger to Tally, a stain on the Dawson family honor. "He's using you, Tally," Caleb said, his voice harsh, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "He's a criminal, an outlaw. He'll never change. He'll only bring you pain and suffering." Tally tried to reason with him, to explain her feelings for Jack, to convince him that he was a different man now. But Caleb was deaf to her pleas, blinded by his own prejudices, his own fears. "You've chosen him over your family, Tally," he said, his voice cold, his words cutting deep. "You've broken the bonds that tie us together. You've betrayed everything we stand for." His words were a devastating blow, a rejection that shattered Tally's heart. She had lost her husband, and now she was losing her brother, the two most important men in her life. She was torn, divided, caught between her love for Jack and her loyalty to her family. "I haven't chosen him over you, Caleb," she pleaded, her voice trembling with emotion. "I love you. You'll always be my brother. But I also love Jack. I can't help how I feel." "Then you've made your choice," Caleb said, his voice final, his expression unyielding. He turned and walked away, leaving Tally alone, heartbroken, feeling as if the very foundations of her life were crumbling beneath her feet. Jack, witnessing the scene from a distance, felt a surge of guilt, of responsibility for the pain he had caused. He knew he was the reason for the rift between Tally and Caleb, the catalyst for the turmoil that had engulfed her life. "I'm sorry, Tally," he said, his voice filled with remorse, his hand reaching out to comfort her. "I never wanted to hurt you, to cause you this pain." Tally shook her head, tears streaming down her face.
"It's not your fault, Jack," she said.
It's just the way things are. The price of freedom, I suppose." He pulled her close, holding her tight, offering his strength, his support, his unwavering love. He knew he couldn't fix everything, couldn't erase the pain, but he could be there for her, to help her through the storm. "We'll get through this, Tally," he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with determination. "We'll face whatever comes our way, together. We'll forge our own path, create our own future." His words were a promise, a vow to stand by her, to fight for their love, to overcome the obstacles that stood in their way. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, dangerous, but he was willing to take the risk, to face the challenges, for the sake of their love, for the sake of the future they were building together. He knew he had to confront Silas, to find a way to end the threat, to secure their freedom. He couldn't live in constant fear, always looking over his shoulder, waiting for the inevitable. He had to take control of the situation, to protect Tally, to protect their future. He had to be the man she believed he could be, the man he was striving to become. The bonds with the past were broken, and with Tally at his side, he felt new promises being forged, stronger than steel, and he was ready. Chapter 13. When the past collides with the present. Jack's decision to confront Silas was born of a desperate need to protect Tally, to secure their future, to break free from the shackles of his past. He knew it was a dangerous gamble, a risky maneuver that could cost him his freedom, his life. But he couldn't stand idly by, waiting for Silas to make his move, living in constant fear of the inevitable. He planned carefully, meticulously, weighing his options, calculating the risks. He knew he couldn't face Silas alone, not in a straight-up gunfight. Silas was a seasoned Pinkerton agent, a skilled marksman, a ruthless hunter. Jack needed an advantage, an edge, something to level the playing field. He decided to use his knowledge of the town, of the surrounding landscape, to his benefit. He knew redemption like the back of his hand, its hidden alleys, its secret passages, its surrounding canyons and mesas. He would lure Silas out of town, into a terrain where he had the upper hand, where he could use his skills, his cunning, to outwit his pursuer. He confided in Tally, sharing his plan, his fears, his hopes. She was terrified, of course, but she also understood the necessity of his actions. She knew he couldn't live in constant fear, always looking over his shoulder. She trusted him, believed in him, and she offered her support, her unwavering love. "Be careful, Jack," she pleaded, her voice trembling with emotion, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and love. "Please be careful. I couldn't bear to lose you." He kissed her, a tender, passionate kiss that conveyed all the love, all the fear, all the hope that filled their hearts. "I will," he promised. "I'll come back to you. I swear it." He left under the cover of darkness, disappearing into the shadows, a lone figure embarking on a dangerous mission. Tally watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with 1,000 fears, 1,000 prayers. Jack rode out of town, heading toward the rugged canyons that lay to the west of Redemption. He knew Silas would follow, that the Pinkerton agent wouldn't be able to resist the bait. He was leaving a clear trail, making it easy for Silas to track him, luring him into a trap. As he rode, he thought of Tally, of her unwavering love, of her strength, of her courage. She was his anchor, his inspiration, his reason for fighting, his hope for a future free from the shadows of his past. He reached the canyons, a labyrinth of narrow passages, towering cliffs, and hidden caves. It was a dangerous terrain, a place where a man could easily get lost, ambushed, killed. But it was also a place where Jack felt at home, a place where he could use his skills, his knowledge, to his advantage. He dismounted, leaving his horse hidden in a secluded alcove, and continued on foot, making his way through the treacherous landscape. He was waiting, listening, watching, anticipating Silas's arrival. He didn't have to wait long. He heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, the telltale signs of a horse moving cautiously through the canyons. Silas was here. The hunt was on. Jack took cover behind a large boulder, his gun drawn, his senses alert. He was ready. He had prepared for this moment, rehearsed it in his mind 1,000 times. He would face his past, confront his pursuer, and fight for his future. Silas appeared, riding slowly, cautiously, his eyes scanning the landscape, his gun drawn. He was a formidable opponent, a skilled tracker, a relentless hunter. But he was also outnumbered, outmaneuvered. He had walked into Jack's trap. Jack stepped out from behind the boulder, his gun leveled at Silas. "It's over, Silas," he said, his voice calm, his gaze unwavering. "Drop your weapon." Silas stopped, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in anger. He had been outsmarted, outplayed. He had underestimated Jack Hollister. "Hollister," he said, his voice cold, his eyes filled with hatred. "I should have known you'd be hiding in the shadows, like the coward you are." "I'm not hiding, Silas," Jack said. "I'm standing my ground. I'm fighting for my life, for my future." "You have no future, Hollister," Silas sneered. "You're a dead man walking. You'll hang for your crimes." "Maybe," Jack said. "But not today. Not here." He had the advantage, the element of surprise. But he also knew that Silas was dangerous, desperate, and that he wouldn't go down without a fight. The past had collided with the present, and the outcome was far from certain. And as they stared at each other, guns drawn, the air was filled with a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Chapter 14. The storm within, the tempest without. The standoff in the canyon was a culmination of everything that had transpired between Jack, Tally, and the long shadow of his past. The air crackled with tension, the silence punctuated only by the harsh whisper of the wind and the pounding of their hearts. Jack, with the advantage of surprise and terrain, held his gun steady, his gaze unwavering. Silas, trapped and outmaneuvered, glared at him with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "Drop the gun, Silas," Jack repeated, his voice calm but firm, betraying none of the turmoil within. "It doesn't have to end this way." Silas sneered, his fingers tightening around the grip of his revolver. "You think I'm afraid to die, Hollister?" He spat. "I've faced death 1,000 times. You're nothing but a two-bit outlaw, a coward hiding behind a woman's skirts." The insult, aimed at both Jack and Tally, stung. But Jack refused to rise to the bait. He wouldn't let Silas provoke him, wouldn't let his anger cloud his judgment. He had to stay focused, stay calm, to win this confrontation. "This isn't about fear, Silas," Jack said, his voice even. "It's about justice. It's about my life, my future. And I'm not going to let you take that away from me." "You have no future," Silas retorted. "You're a wanted man. You'll always be looking over your shoulder, always running. You'll never be free." "Maybe," Jack conceded. "But I'm not running anymore. I'm standing my ground. I'm fighting for a new life, a life with Tally." The mention of Tally's name seemed to enrage Silas further. "She's a fool," he said, his voice filled with contempt. "She's blinded by your lies, your false promises. She'll learn the truth about you, soon enough." "Tally knows the truth," Jack said, his voice hardening. She knows who I am, who I was. And she loves me anyway. She believes in me. Love? Silas scoffed. Love is a weakness, Hollister. It'll be your downfall. As they spoke, the sky above darkened, the wind picking up, swirling dust and debris through the canyon. A storm was brewing, a tempest mirroring the internal turmoil of the two men, the clash between their pasts and their uncertain futures. Jack knew he couldn't stand here all day, locked in a stalemate with Silas. He had to act, to end this confrontation one way or another. He had the advantage, but Silas was desperate, dangerous, and he wouldn't hesitate to shoot. Last chance, Silas, Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. Drop the gun, or I'll be forced to shoot. Silas hesitated, his eyes flickering between Jack's gun and the treacherous terrain that surrounded them. He was trapped, outgunned, but his pride, his stubbornness, wouldn't allow him to surrender. With a sudden, swift movement, Silas raised his gun, firing a shot that whizzed past Jack's head, narrowly missing him. Jack reacted instantly, firing back, his shot hitting Silas in the shoulder, spinning him around, knocking him to the ground. Silas cried out in pain, his gun clattering on the rocks. He clutched his wounded shoulder, his face contorted in agony, his eyes filled with hatred and defeat. Jack stood over him, his gun still trained on him, his heart pounding in his chest, his body trembling with adrenaline. He had won. He had survived. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the violence, by the knowledge that he had been forced to shoot another man. The storm broke, unleashing its fury upon the canyon. Rain lashed down, thunder roared. Lightning illuminated the scene in brief, stark flashes. The tempest without mirrored the storm within Jack, the turmoil of emotions that raged within him. He had confronted his past, faced his pursuer, and emerged victorious.
But the cost had been high.
He had been forced to resort to violence, to take up arms, to relive the life he had been trying so hard to escape. He looked down at Silas, his wounded enemy, and felt a pang of remorse, of regret. He didn't want to kill him. He didn't want to take another life. He lowered his gun, holstering it, his decision made. He would spare Silas's life, take him back to redemption, and turn him over to Sheriff Brody. He would let the law handle it, let justice take its course. The storm was raging, and he knew, as the lightning illuminated the canyon, that it was a reflection of a deeper storm, one which was raging within his own heart. Chapter 15. A Reckoning Under the Desert Moon. The journey back to redemption with Silas was arduous, the storm raging around them, turning the dusty trails into treacherous mudslides. Jack, his own body aching from the strain of the confrontation and the relentless weather, kept a watchful eye on his prisoner. Silas, wounded and defeated, remained sullen and silent, his hatred simmering beneath the surface. Tally, meanwhile, waited anxiously at the bakery, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. She had heard the distant gunshots, the echoes reverberating through the town, and she knew that Jack was facing his past, fighting for their future. She paced restlessly, her hands clasped together, praying for his safety, for his return. As the storm began to subside, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of moon hanging in the vast, inky sky, Jack finally arrived, leading Silas, his hands bound, his shoulder bandaged. The sight of him, weary but alive, sent a wave of relief washing over Tally. She ran to him, throwing her arms around him, holding him tight, tears streaming down her face. "You're alive," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank God, you're alive." He held her close, burying his face in her hair, finding comfort in her embrace, in her warmth, in her unwavering love. "I told you I'd come back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Sheriff Brody, alerted by the commotion, arrived at the bakery, his expression grim but relieved. He took Silas into custody, his gaze lingering on Jack, a mixture of respect and apprehension in his eyes. "You did a good thing, Hollister," Brody said, his voice quiet. "You brought him in alive. That's more than most men would have done." Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on Tally, his heart overflowing with love for her. He had faced his past, confronted his demons, and emerged victorious. But he knew the battle wasn't over. Silas's capture was just one step in their journey, a step toward a future that was still uncertain, still fraught with challenges. After Brody had taken Silas away, Jack and Tally returned to the quiet solitude of the bakery. They sat together, hand in hand, the silence between them comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cleansed, refreshed landscape, a sense of peace that mirrored the calm that had settled over them.
"What will happen to him?"
Tally asked, her voice soft, her gaze searching Jack's. "He'll stand trial," Jack said. "He'll likely be sent to prison. He'll pay for his crimes." "And what about us?" she continued, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "What about our future?" Jack smiled, a slow, tender smile that reached his eyes. "We'll face it together, Tally," he said. "Whatever comes our way, we'll face it together. We've come this far. We've survived. We'll build a life here, in redemption, a life free from the shadows of my past." His words were a promise, a vow to stand by her, to fight for their love, to create a new life for themselves. Tally leaned her head against his shoulder, finding comfort in his strength, in his unwavering presence. But even as they sat there, basking in the quiet aftermath of the storm, a new challenge emerged, a reckoning that would test their love, their resilience, their commitment to each other. Caleb appeared at the door of the bakery, his silhouette framed against the soft glow of the moonlit sky. He stood there, silent, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on Jack and Tally. Tally's heart sank. She knew this confrontation was inevitable, that Caleb wouldn't simply accept their relationship, that he wouldn't forgive Jack's past, his perceived transgressions. "Caleb," she said, her voice soft, her hand reaching out to him. "Please." He stepped inside, his presence filling the small bakery, his gaze unwavering. He didn't speak to Tally. He looked directly at Jack, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, resentment, and a deep, abiding hurt. "You've taken everything from me, Hollister," Caleb said, his voice low and tight, his words laced with accusation. "My sister, my family, my peace of mind. You've brought nothing but trouble and pain to this town." Jack stood up, facing Caleb squarely, his own expression calm but resolute. "I know you hate me, Caleb," he said. "And I understand why. But I love Tally. And I'm not going to let you come between us." "She's a Dawson," Caleb said, his voice rising. "She belongs with her family, with her own kind. Not with an outlaw, a criminal, a man who will always be a threat to her safety." "I'm not that man anymore, Caleb," Jack said, his voice firm, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I'm trying to change. I'm trying to build a new life, a life with Tally." A full moon shone above, and under it, the three of them faced a reckoning. Tally, her love, and her family, the past colliding with the promise of a future yet to be written. Chapter 16. The fragile threads of hope and fear. The confrontation between Jack and Caleb, under the stark light of the desert moon, was a clash of loyalties, a battle between family ties and romantic love. Tally stood between them, torn, her heart aching for both men, for the brother she loved and the man she had chosen. "Caleb, please," Tally pleaded, her voice trembling with emotion. "Try to understand. Jack is not the man you think he is. He's changed. He's trying to be better." Caleb ignored her, his gaze fixed on Jack, his eyes filled with a cold, unwavering anger. "You can't change who you are, Hollister," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "You're an outlaw, a criminal. You'll always be a danger to her, to this town." "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Caleb," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt people. But I'm not going to apologize for loving Tally. And I'm not going to let you take her away from me." "She's not yours to take," Caleb retorted, his voice rising. "She's a Dawson. She belongs with her family, with her own kind. She's a woman," Caleb, Jack countered, his own anger starting to rise. She's not a possession. She has a right to choose her own path, to love who she wants. The argument escalated, their voices growing louder, their words sharper, their emotions raw and exposed. Tally felt as if she were being torn apart, caught in the crossfire between two men she loved, two men who represented different worlds, different values. "You're a fool," Tally, Caleb said, finally turning to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of disappointment and pity. "You're blinded by him, by his lies, by his false promises. He'll break your heart. He'll ruin your life." "That's not true, Caleb," Tally said, her voice shaking, tears streaming down her face. "I love him.
And he loves me.
We can make this work. We can build a life together." "You're choosing him over your family," Caleb said, his voice cold, his words a final, devastating blow. "You're turning your back on everything we stand for." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Tally heartbroken, shattered, feeling as if the very foundations of her life were crumbling beneath her feet. Jack reached out to her, his hand gently caressing her cheek, his eyes filled with concern and a deep, abiding love. "I'm sorry, Tally," he said, his voice soft, his words filled with remorse. "I never wanted to cause you this pain, to come between you and your brother." Tally shook her head, tears blurring her vision.
"It's not your fault, Jack," she said.
It's just the way things are. The price of freedom, I suppose." He pulled her close, holding her tight, offering his strength, his support, his unwavering presence. He knew he couldn't fix everything, couldn't erase the pain, but he could be there for her, to help her through the storm. The following days were difficult, filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Silas was awaiting trial, his fate hanging in the balance. Jack continued to work at the livery stable, trying to prove himself, to earn the trust of the townsfolk. But the shadow of his past, the rift with Caleb, hung over them, a constant reminder of the challenges they faced. Tally, despite her heartbreak, tried to remain strong, to support Jack, to believe in their future. She continued to run the bakery, finding solace in the familiar routine, in the comforting aroma of fresh bread, in the small acts of kindness and connection with her customers. But she also felt a growing sense of isolation, of being an outsider in her own town. She had chosen love over family, freedom over tradition, and the price was steep. She had lost her brother's love, his respect, his support. One evening, as she was closing up the bakery, a group of townsfolk approached her, their faces grim, their eyes filled with suspicion and resentment. They were led by Jedediah, a local rancher, a man known for his harsh judgment and his unwavering adherence to the town's unspoken code. "We don't want him here, Miss Dawson," Jedediah said, his voice cold, his words a threat. "Hollister. He's a danger to our town, to our families. He needs to leave." Tally's heart sank. She had feared this, anticipated this, but the reality of it was still a devastating blow. She was being ostracized, rejected by her own community, because of her love for Jack. The fragile threads of hope they clung to were starting to unravel, under constant pull of fear. And she knew, with heavy dread, that those threads could snap entirely at any moment. Chapter 17. Where Honor Meets Betrayal. The confrontation with Jedediah and the townsfolk was a stark reminder of the precariousness of Tally and Jack's situation. They were living on the fringes of redemption society, tolerated but not accepted, their love a constant source of tension and conflict. Tally tried to remain strong, to stand up for Jack, to defend their relationship. But she was also weary, exhausted by the constant battle, the endless whispers, the unrelenting pressure. She longed for peace, for acceptance, for a life free from fear and judgment. "We can't stay here, Jack," she said one evening, as they sat together in the quiet solitude of the bakery. "They'll never accept us. They'll never let us be happy." Jack knew she was right. He had tried to build a new life in redemption, to prove himself worthy of Tally's love, but the town's resistance, fueled by fear and prejudice, was too strong to overcome. He was a constant reminder of the violence, the lawlessness, the uncertainty that they had tried so hard to leave behind. "I know," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I've been thinking the same thing. We need to leave,
Tally.
We need to find a place where we can start over, where we can be free from the shadows of my past." The decision to leave Redemption was a painful one, a bittersweet acknowledgement that their dream of building a life together in the town she had always called home was not to be. But it was also a necessary decision, a step toward a future where they could be free from judgment, from fear, from the constant threat of violence. They began to make plans, quietly, secretly, preparing for their departure. They would leave under the cover of darkness, heading west, toward California, toward the promise of a new beginning, a new life. But their plans were disrupted, betrayed by someone they trusted, someone they considered a friend. Sheriff Brody, the man who had given Jack a second chance, the man who had seemed to understand their plight, had secretly contacted the Pinkerton agency, informing them of Jack's whereabouts, of his impending departure. Brody, it turned out, was not the weary, compassionate lawman he had appeared to be. He was ambitious, driven by a desire for recognition, for advancement, and he saw Jack's capture as a way to achieve his goals. He had used Tally and Jack, manipulated their trust, and betrayed them for his own selfish gain. The Pinkertons, led by a new agent, a ruthless, determined man named Kincaid, arrived in Redemption, their arrival coinciding with Tally and Jack's planned departure. They surrounded the bakery, trapping them, cutting off their escape. Jack, realizing they had been betrayed, felt a surge of anger, of betrayal, but also a cold, hard determination. He wouldn't be taken without a fight. He would protect Tally, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. "Stay here, Tally," he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. "I'll handle this." He grabbed his gun, preparing to face the Pinkertons, to fight for their freedom, for their future. But Tally refused to stay behind. She wouldn't let him face them alone. She would stand by his side, fight alongside him, no matter the cost. "No, Jack," she said, her voice strong, her eyes flashing with defiance. "We're in this together. We'll face them together." She grabbed a rifle from behind the counter, a weapon she had learned to use from her father, a weapon she had hoped never to use again. But she was a Dawson, and she wouldn't back down, wouldn't surrender. She would fight for her love, for her freedom, for her future. They stepped out of the bakery, side by side, facing the Pinkertons, a united front against the forces that sought to tear them apart. The scene was a stark tableau, a showdown between love and betrayal, between hope and despair, between the law and the outlaw's heart. Honor was meeting betrayal. And in that dusty street, under the cold light of dawn, only one could prevail. Chapter 18. The echo of gunfire, the silence of regret. The confrontation outside the bakery was swift and brutal, a chaotic clash of gunfire and desperate struggles. Jack and Tally, outnumbered but resolute, fought with a fierce determination, their love for each other fueling their courage, their desperation. Jack, with his years of experience in gunfights, moved with a practiced ease, his shots finding their mark, taking down several Pinkertons. But Kincaid, the ruthless leader, was a formidable opponent, his skills honed by years of tracking and capturing outlaws. Tally, despite her lack of experience, proved to be a valuable ally. She used the rifle with a surprising accuracy, her shots providing cover for Jack, keeping the Pinkertons at bay. She was a Dawson, after all, and the spirit of the frontier, the instinct for survival, ran deep in her veins. But the odds were stacked against them. The Pinkertons were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Jack took a bullet to the arm, a searing pain that weakened him, slowed him down. Tally, seeing him wounded, cried out in alarm, her fear for his safety momentarily distracting her. Kincaid seized the opportunity, his gun aimed at Tally, his finger tightening on the trigger. Jack, seeing the danger, reacted instantly, throwing himself in front of Tally, shielding her with his body. The shot rang out, echoing through the dusty streets of Redemption. Jack grunted in pain, his body convulsing, as the bullet struck him in the chest, a mortal wound. He collapsed to the ground, his lifeblood staining the dusty earth. Tally screamed, a heart-wrenching cry of anguish and despair. She dropped the rifle, rushing to Jack's side, cradling his head in her lap, tears streaming down her face.
Jack, no.
Please, no, she cried, her voice choked with emotion, her hands desperately trying to staunch the flow of blood. Jack looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain, love, and a deep, profound regret. He reached out, his hand weakly caressing her cheek, his touch of final farewell. Tally, I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice fading, his breath shallow. I love you. His hand fell limp, his eyes closed, his body stilled. He was gone. The outlaw, the drifter, the man she loved, had died protecting her, sacrificing his life for hers. The remaining Pinkertons, stunned by the sudden turn of events, hesitated, their guns lowered. Kincaid, his face a mask of cold indifference, stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Tally. It's over, he said, his voice devoid of emotion.
He's dead.
Tally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief, hatred, and a newfound resolve. She had lost everything. Her husband, her brother, and now, the man she loved, the man who had shown her a glimpse of a different future, a future that had been brutally snatched away from her. She rose to her feet, her body trembling with rage, with grief, with a desperate need for vengeance. She picked up Jack's gun, her hand steady, her gaze unwavering. No, she said, her voice cold, her eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. It's not over. It's just beginning. The echo of gunfire still reverberated through the town. It was a short burst, but its consequences were far-reaching, shattering the fragile peace, leaving behind a silence filled with regret. And in that silence, Tally stood, the gun heavy in her hand, the only sound her ragged breathing and the whisper of the wind. Chapter 19. Redemption's long and dusty road. Tally's threat, spoken over Jack's lifeless body, was not an idle one. She was a Dawson, and the Dawsons were known for their resilience, their strength, and their unwavering commitment to justice, even if it meant taking the law into their own hands. She had lost everything, her heart shattered, her future stolen. But she still had her spirit, her courage, and a burning desire for vengeance. She would not let Jack's death be in vain. She would make Kincaid and the Pinkertons pay for their crimes. She knew she couldn't face them alone, not in a straight-up gunfight. She needed help, allies, someone to stand with her, to fight alongside her. And she knew where to find them. She turned to the townsfolk, the people who had ostracized her, judged her, condemned her for her love for Jack. They had gathered at a distance, watching the scene unfold, their faces a mixture of fear, shock, and a dawning realization of the injustice that had been committed. He died protecting me, Tally said, her voice loud and clear, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. He died protecting this town from men like Kincaid, from men who care nothing for justice, for the law, for human life. Her words resonated with the townsfolk, stirring something within them, a sense of shame, of guilt, of a shared responsibility for Jack's death. They had allowed their fear, their prejudice, to blind them, to drive them to betray a man who had been trying to change, to build a new life. Jedediah, the rancher who had led the group demanding Jack's departure, stepped forward, his face filled with remorse, with regret. "We were wrong, Miss Dawson," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "We judged him too harshly. We let fear cloud our judgment." Others joined him, their voices rising in a chorus of agreement, of apology, of a newfound respect for Jack, for Tally, for their courage, their love. And then, a figure emerged from the crowd, a figure Tally had thought she had lost forever. Caleb, her brother, his face etched with grief, with remorse, with a deep, abiding love for his sister. He walked toward Tally, his eyes filled with tears, his arms reaching out to her. "I'm sorry, Tally," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I was wrong.
I was so wrong about him.
He was a good man. And I pushed him away. I pushed you away. Tally fell into his arms, sobbing, her grief overwhelming, her relief at his return a balm to her wounded soul. They held each other tight, their bond restored, their love rekindled, forged in the crucible of loss and regret. Caleb turned to the townsfolk, his voice strong, his gaze unwavering. "We'll stand with you, Tally," he said. "We'll fight for justice, for Jack, for what's right." The townsfolk rallied around them, their fear replaced by a newfound determination, a shared commitment to right the wrongs that had been committed. They would stand together, united, against Kincaid and the Pinkertons. They armed themselves, preparing for a final confrontation, a battle for the soul of redemption. They would not be intimidated, they would not be silenced. They would fight for justice, for honor, for the memory of the man who had died protecting them. Tally, with Caleb by her side and the support of the townsfolk, felt a surge of strength, of purpose. She would avenge Jack's death, she would make Kincaid pay, and she would finally find redemption, not just for Jack, but for herself, for her town. The road was still long and dusty, but with her brother and the town at her side, she felt ready to walk it. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The final confrontation with Kincaid and the remaining Pinkertons took place at the edge of town, where the dusty streets met the vast, open expanse of the Arizona Territory. It was a symbolic setting, a place where the old ways clashed with the new, where the law of the gun met the yearning for justice, where the past collided with the promise of a different future. Tally, Caleb, and the armed townsfolk faced Kincaid and his men, a united front against the forces of corruption and greed. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind and the pounding of hearts. "This is your last chance, Kincaid," Tally said, her voice clear and strong, her gaze unwavering. "Surrender, and face justice for your crimes." Kincaid sneered, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "You're in no position to make demands, Miss Dawson," he said. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. You're fighting a losing battle." "We're fighting for what's right," Tally countered, her voice filled with conviction. "We're fighting for justice, for honor, for the memory of a good man." "There's no honor among thieves, Miss Dawson," Kincaid retorted. "And your outlaw lover was nothing but a thief, a killer, a man who deserved to die." Caleb stepped forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "He was a better man than you'll ever be, Kincaid," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "He died protecting my sister, protecting this town. He died a hero." The argument escalated, their words like sparks igniting a powder keg. It was clear that a peaceful resolution was impossible. The final confrontation was inevitable. With a sudden, swift movement, Kincaid drew his gun, firing a shot that narrowly missed Tally. The battle erupted, a chaotic clash of gunfire, shouts, and desperate struggles. Tally, Caleb, and the townsfolk fought with a fierce determination, their courage fueled by a shared sense of purpose, by a burning desire for justice. They had the advantage of numbers, of knowing the terrain, but Kincaid and his men were skilled marksmen, experienced fighters. The battle raged, the outcome uncertain. Several townsfolk were wounded, some fatally. Caleb took a bullet to the shoulder, but he continued to fight, his determination unwavering. Tally, fueled by a mixture of grief, rage, and a desperate need for vengeance, fought with a ferocity she hadn't known she possessed. She moved through the chaos, her gun blazing, her shots finding their mark. Finally, it came down to Tally and Kincaid, facing each other in a one-on-one showdown. Kincaid, wounded but still dangerous, sneered at her, his eyes filled with hatred. "You can't win, Miss Dawson," he said, his voice weak but defiant. "You're just a woman. You don't have the stomach for this. You underestimate me." "Kincaid," Tally said, her voice cold, her eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. "I'm a Dawson. And we don't back down. We don't give up. We fight for what we believe in." They fired simultaneously, their shots echoing through the stillness. Kincaid's bullet grazed Tally's arm, a searing pain that momentarily stunned her. But Tally's shot found its mark, striking Kincaid in the chest, a mortal wound. He staggered backward, his eyes widening in surprise, in disbelief, and then he collapsed to the ground, his body still, his life extinguished. The remaining Pinkertons, seeing their leader fall, surrendered, their weapons dropping to the dusty earth. The battle was over. Justice had been served. Tally stood there, her body trembling, her heart pounding, her guns still smoking. She had avenged Jack's death. She had defeated Kincaid. She had protected her town. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the violence, by the loss, by the knowledge that nothing could ever bring Jack back. Caleb, his arm bandaged, came to her side, his hand reaching out to comfort her. "It's over, Tally," he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "You did it. You were magnificent." The townsfolk gathered around them, their faces filled with gratitude, with respect, with a newfound appreciation for Tally's courage, her strength, her unwavering commitment to justice. Tally looked out at the vast, open expanse of the Arizona Territory, the setting sun casting long shadows across the land. She had found redemption, not just for Jack, but for herself, for her town. She had faced her demons, confronted her past, and emerged stronger, more resilient, more determined than ever before. The final confrontation had been of both hearts and horizons. She was a Dawson, and a new horizon, a new beginning awaited. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to Tally's resilience, her strength, and her unwavering commitment to building a new life, a life that honored Jack's memory while forging her own path. Redemption, slowly but surely, began to heal, the scars of the past fading, replaced by a newfound sense of unity, of purpose, of hope. Caleb, his relationship with Tally restored and stronger than ever, became a pillar of the community, a leader, a protector, a man who had learned the true meaning of love, of forgiveness, of second chances. He never married, his heart forever touched by the loss and the sacrifices made, but he found solace in supporting Tally, in helping her rebuild her life. The bakery became a symbol of hope, of resilience, of the enduring power of community. Tally continued to bake, her bread a source of comfort, of nourishment, of connection for the townsfolk. The aroma of freshly baked bread, mingling with the scent of sagebrush and the desert wind, became a reminder of the past, a tribute to the present, and a promise for the future. Tally never forgot Jack, his memory a constant presence in her life, a guiding light that illuminated her path. She often visited his grave, a simple marker on a windswept hill overlooking the town, a place where she could find solace, where she could whisper her thoughts, her dreams, her enduring love. She never remarried, her heart forever belonging to the outlaw, the drifter, the man who had shown her the true meaning of freedom, of courage, of unconditional love. But she wasn't alone. She had Caleb. She had the townsfolk. She had a community that had embraced her, supported her, and helped her heal. As the years passed, redemption transformed, evolving from a rough and tumble frontier town into a thriving community, a place where people could live in peace, where justice prevailed, where hope flourished. The echoes of gunfire faded, replaced by the laughter of children, the sounds of commerce, the gentle hum of a community building a new life, a new future. Tally, her hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with the wisdom of years, often sat on the porch of the bakery, watching the sun set over the vast, open expanse of the Arizona Territory. She had lived a long and full life, a life marked by loss, by grief, but also by love, by courage, by an unwavering commitment to justice, to honor, to the enduring power of the human spirit. She had found redemption, not just for Jack, but for herself, for her town. She had faced her demons, confronted her past, and emerged stronger, more resilient, more determined than ever before. She was a Dawson, and the spirit of the frontier, the spirit of love and resilience, lived on in her, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart. The sun had set on many days, but it had also risen on many more, and she had lived them all fully and with a heart that, despite all, had never stopped loving, never stopped hoping. The end.